The autumn wind is a pirate, blustering in from sea. With a rollicking song he sweeps along, swaggering boisterously. His face is weather-beaten. He wears a hooded sash, with a silver hat about his head, and a bristling black mustache. He growls as he storms the country, a villain big and bold. And the trees all shake and quiver and quake as he robs them of their gold. The autumn wind is a raider, pillaging just for fun.
I don't shine shoes, I don't tape ankles, I don't cut checks. Great cash, homie.
Come on. Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast,
Welcome to the Week 9 edition of the Rearview Mirror podcast. This is a podcast where we look back at everything from Week 8, what we just saw, try to figure out why these teams won, why they lost, break it all down for you, get a better understanding of who these teams are, what they're doing to win or cost themselves games, and how we could perhaps apply some of that knowledge to upcoming games, looking for value that might not be obvious there, getting beneath the box scores, and getting into these games in greater level of detail to try to extract useful information that can be predicted for us for the upcoming week of the season. With that said, let's jump right into the headlines. Story number one, we're looking at a very rare week in the NFL this upcoming week. The reason it's so rare is that we have mostly favorites, which are 3 points or less. So favorites laying 1, 2, or 3 points, or we're seeing favorites laying double digits, 10, 11, 12 points, 15 points in some extremes. So you do not have this week but one team currently at Pinnacle that's laying between 3 points and 10 points, and that is the Cleveland Browns laying 6.5 versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'm sure you can imagine this doesn't happen very much. In fact, over the last 25 years, looking at every single week of action in the NFL, there's only been one other week that actually has only one team that was laying more than 3 points but less than 10 points, a week that only saw one team laying that type of spread as a favorite. Even if you say, okay, there were going to be 2 or maybe even 3 favorites that are going to be laying between 3 and 7, it's still extremely rare. It hasn't happened more when you're talking about two teams laying that type of spread. That's happened 2 other times. If you're talking about 3 teams, that's happened maybe 10 other times. So most of the time you're seeing 4, 5, 6, 7 favorites on a given week laying over 3 points but less than 10 points. And this week you're just not seeing that. What does that mean? It means for dog bettors, you're either looking to back some very ugly road dogs who are obviously going to be outmatched, catching double digits and hoping for, at worst, a backdoor cover, at best, perhaps a close contest throughout the game where you're going to cover comfortably. So that's what you're rooting for if you are catching one of these ugly dogs, catching double digits. If you're catching a small dog who's catching less than 3 points, obviously it's probably in your best interest to lay a little bit on the money line at that point in time because there's not a whole lot of value that you're going to be getting here, unfortunately, for dog bettors on the board. You're going to have to find some underdogs where you think they're going to win outright or some underdogs that you think might be able to compete on a huge spread for a favorite. Story number 2, Wembley Field, these London games. We looked at a game this past weekend where the field ended up getting really chewed up with this Detroit Lions Atlanta Falcons game, and we saw Nick Fairley go down with a knee injury. We saw just bad football at times being played by guys slipping, and the question becomes, why are we having these games here? And obviously it's for money. Everything that the NFL does, specifically everything Roger Goodell tries to change with the NFL, is 100% about money. I'll rant about this for 1 minute and then I'll just shut up because it's just pointless to keep talking about Roger Goodell. But all these different rules changes that he's implemented, 100% of them are for increasing scoring and getting more commercials or making more money for the league or keeping from losing money by avoiding lawsuits and things like that so that he can say, well, we're being proactive here. We're trying to investigate this, analyze this, cut down on these types of penalties so that he's not going to lose money down the road with ex-players suing the league and trying to win cases because the league was negligent. They understood that these things could be harmful and they did not make any moves to change them. So even in those situations where you can say they're for player safety, it's really just protecting the league from future lawsuits, trying to keep their money in their pockets. They're also making these rules changes a lot of them, not necessarily to help player safety, more so that they increase scoring. And obviously when you're looking at football games, commercial breaks because there's so many points being scored. That's first and foremost. Number 2, your interest is always in that game because you want to see points scored. Most fans like seeing touchdowns. They like seeing big plays. They like seeing excitement. So they're going to watch for that. And then number 3, when you always have the opportunity to score points quickly in football because of rules that are designed to help the passing game and the offenses, you are almost never really 100% out of the game. That's why we've seen this past week so many different comebacks, whether it was the Detroit Lions coming back over the Atlanta Falcons, even this game with the Indianapolis Colts and the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers were crushing them, but the Colts actually were only down by 1 score late in that game, and it's because they got a turnover, scored a touchdown on both sides of that turnover. So they are, there's this hope and this opportunity that the game might never truly be out of hand, and so that keeps viewers there watching it and keeps it interesting for fans, and obviously then there's the ad feed. So the field over there is pretty terrible. Goodell's talking about having more games being played there, possibly relocating teams there and all types of things. If they're going to try to do that, they need to have a field that's set up strictly for football, the grass is grown and utilized strictly for American-style football, because it's such a different surface that's needed. And if you've got light soccer players who are 180 pounds just jogging all over the field in a very spread-out manner, it's very different than stacking 300-pound linemen, 350-pound linemen inches apart from one another, fighting over space. You got like 10 guys bunched into like a 10-by-10 box out on the field, just moving all around like a rugby scrum almost. It's that's going to chew up the turf a lot differently. So it hadn't even rained over there for days, yet the ground was really bad condition. And so you're talking about player safety. If Goodell's serious about player safety, he would do something about that field to make sure that it was in better condition. I don't think that's where his priority is, because I don't think he really cares about that type of thing. He's just trying to make more money for the league and for the owners, and that's pretty much what he's all about. Story number 3. Wanted to look at NFLproject.com for one particular reason this week, and that is they've introduced a new feature here. And this feature basically takes a look at projected true playoff seeds and matchups. And what is unique and cool about this is that unlike the NFL.com or all these other types of websites that say, well, if the season ended today, these are the teams that would be in the playoffs, that is not what NFLproject.com is doing with this graphic here. This is projecting out the rest of the season as games are being played out the rest of the way, acknowledging what's happened year to date and forecasting the rest of the season based upon this complex machine learning algorithm to determine who would be in what seeds. And so okay, I'll just go ahead and name a couple of big differences on this list versus what NFL.com or some of these other websites have. Let's look at the AFC first of all. In the AFC right now, at some of these other sites, they are showing the Cincinnati Bengals as the 3 seed and the Baltimore Ravens not even in the playoffs. They're showing the Baltimore Ravens out of the playoffs. The 2 road wildcard teams are the Buffalo Bills and the San Diego Chargers. So in their simulation, well, it's not actually even a simulation, but what they're broadcasting to thousands and thousands of people is that the Bengals should be hosting a home playoff game and they'd be playing the Bills. The reality is, based upon the way the season could play out, and most likely to play out, the Baltimore Ravens would be the team hosting a playoff game. The Cincinnati Bengals would actually be going on the road versus the Indianapolis Colts. So much, much different scenario there, where you're actually getting a team like the Ravens into the playoffs, and you're taking a team like the Bengals. They're still staying in the playoffs, but they're playing on the road. And so you ask, well, how could that be so different? I thought the Bengals just swept the Baltimore Ravens. They're possibly the better team right now, and they have a 2-0 advantage over the Baltimore Ravens, and all of that is true. But the algorithm for NFLproject.com, obviously very complicated. I didn't write it, so I don't know all the specifics. All I can do is look at the future schedule for the Cincinnati Bengals. And what I see is 2 games in a row that are pretty easy. They take on the Jacksonville Jaguars as 11-point favorites this week. They turn around a short Thursday, but they host the Cleveland Browns in Cincinnati, so that's a good game for them. But then they have 3 straight road games, which include at the Saints, at the Texans, and at the Buccaneers. Now, obviously, they're going to be favored over the Buccaneers, but right now, the rest of their schedule, they're not favored by more than 3 points in any game the rest of the way after they take on the Browns next Thursday. Then they get to come back from that 3-game road trip. They play the Steelers at home. They go and play the Browns in Cleveland. Then they have to host the Broncos, the Denver Broncos, Week 16. Obviously, they're hoping that the Broncos would have their season wrapped up by then, but we would have to see if they ensure home playoffs. This game against Denver this upcoming weekend would be huge in determining that. But if the Broncos, typically from Peyton Manning, you'll see that they will put extra effort out there Week 16, knowing that they'll have a first-round bye and they don't want to take 3 weeks off. They'll probably take Week 17, take it a little bit lighter, then they'll have a bye, but you're probably not going to get Peyton Manning. He's also going to rest Week 16 as well. So you got the Bengals will have to take on the Denver Broncos, and then they go on the road to play the Pittsburgh Steelers Week 17. That game's going to be difficult. That division certainly is still up in the air. Based on these forecasts, you can see that even first-round seed in terms of who wins that division, it's probably not going to be decided until very late in the season. So the Bengals' upcoming schedule, very difficult, and more difficult than the Baltimore Ravens' upcoming schedule as well. If you look at the Ravens' upcoming schedule, you'll see that they certainly do face their share of good teams that they play. They play the San Diego Chargers, but that's in Baltimore, so that's good for them. They also play a road game at the Saints, which is the same thing that the Bengals are doing as well. But you also take into account that the Baltimore Ravens get to face the Titans. They play the Jaguars, the Texans, and the Browns. So they've got overall a little bit of an easier schedule the rest of the way through than do the Cincinnati Bengals. Flipping over to the NFC, even more extreme differences in the NFC compared to what we saw in the AFC. Right now, that the other sites are projecting, saying that the Detroit Lions would have a first-round bye. I'd be shocked if that actually happens. Right now, the projection is that the Detroit Lions would have a 3rd seed, but I guess it certainly is possible. It's not a certainty that they'll have this 3rd seed. They could get a 2nd-round seed and get a first-round bye, which would be absolutely crazy to imagine that the Cardinals and the Lions would be the 2 teams in the NFC with first-round byes this year. But right now, the projection is that the Dallas Cowboys would have that number 2 seed, and you'd be looking at the Lions with the number 3 seed. Now, the Lions, their schedule moving forward is just very difficult. They've got multiple road games. They close the season on the road versus the Packers and versus the Bears in back-to-back weeks in Week 16 and Week 17. So both games, not in a dome, it's outdoors, playing on the road against division rivals. And obviously that game against the Packers is going to be huge because that's another difference between what NFL Project is projecting versus these other sites, is that the Packers currently are not projected to actually make the playoffs. Right now, if you look at the other sites, they're sliding in there as the number 6 seed in the NFC. Here, they missed the playoffs. They're instead being replaced by the Seattle Seahawks, actually, who would be the most likely team to land the number 5 seed, with the Philadelphia Eagles most likely team to land the number 6 seed. And other variances are the Carolina Panthers, currently in the other sites, are being projected as the number 4 seed to host a playoff game, and the Saints not making the playoffs. In the NFLProjects.com model, it has the New Orleans Saints making the playoffs there as the number 4 seed. So that's why one of these games this weekend on Thursday, New Orleans versus Carolina, hugely, hugely important for the future of that division, for the team that's going to be able to ultimately make the playoffs in that division. That game is going to be of vital importance. Now, I'll flip to one other graphic here from NFLProjects.com. You've seen these before. This is the true odds improvement from Week 9. I waited to put out this podcast till I had this data so that we could talk about it here. This is everything I just received today and started analyzing it. But in this graphic, you can certainly see the two teams that were helped the most based upon victories this past weekend included the New Orleans Saints and the Detroit Lions. And the Cincinnati Bengals are not far behind in that list, having a huge win over the Baltimore Ravens. As you can look on the far right of the graphic, you can see Baltimore was hurt the most by any loss this past weekend, even though right now they're still projected based upon the rest of the season to finish in the number 4 seed and win the AFC North. That loss hurt them in terms of their overall odds in accomplishing their goal to a tremendous extent. Had they won that game, they would have definitely been a lot easier path for them the rest of the way through, but they're making it a little bit more difficult on themselves. Obviously, and that game was so close at the end there. Pass interference on Steve Smith, or the Ravens are back up very late in that game. So a great game, obviously, a very competitive game. Looking at that Detroit Lions game, they were down 21-0 to the Atlanta Falcons at halftime. Their franchise had never come from behind to a deficit that large to pull out an outright victory, but they were able to accomplish that, and that win obviously helped them immensely. And then New Orleans Saints, no team was impacted more. 31% improvement in terms of their odds to make the playoffs based upon their victory over the Green Bay Packers. It was massively important, even though Drew Brees tells you that it didn't really matter whatsoever. The fact is, if you keep letting games like that, where you're playing at home in such a great spot and it's prime time, if they would have lost that game and let these opportunities slip away, at some point all you do have to do to make the playoffs is win the NFC South, but you're making every future game that much more pivotal, that much more difficult, and any single loss. And we've seen teams that are good teams have a bad road loss from time to time. A loss like that would cripple the team, and they would not make the playoffs. So that was definitely the definition of a must-win game for them at home in prime time. Had they lost that game, it would have been devastating. Fortunately for them, they did not, and so they currently are projected as the number 4 seed. And so that's why this game on Thursday is going to be very interesting, because you have a team off of a massive high in the New Orleans Saints playing a team who has not looked good for the past 2 weeks in the Carolina Panthers. It's a divisional game. Carolina Panthers were down last week after that loss to Seattle. Their offense is not looking good. Cam Newton is not looking good. He did not look good 2 weeks ago up in Green Bay. He now has not looked good for a couple weeks in a row after looking great to start the season. Now they take on the New Orleans Saints. Obviously, I like the dynamic and the intrigue here because it's New Orleans playing on the road, where they've struggled historically and this season. So they have to play on the road, but I think that helps. Obviously, the competition level should make the game more competitive. I think in this stage, if the Saints were playing at home on Thursday night, they would demolish the Carolina Panthers. So I'm happy that it's going to be hopefully a much more competitive game in Carolina and get to see a pretty entertaining game. But whoever wins this game, you can see their odds were really night and day different last week. Whoever wins this game is really going to crush the team who ends up losing it. And if you take a look at the line swing, you can see at the LDH, this line opened with the Carolina Panthers a 1.5-point favorite. It swung all the way to the New Orleans Saints being a 2.5-point favorite. If you look, for instance, at Pinnacle, Carolina, it opened as a pick'em, and now the New Orleans Saints are favored by 3 points. So early money, early betting has come in on the team that just looked good last week, so no surprise there. Fading the team that has looked poor. So it'll be really interesting to see how that game ends up playing out. With that said, let's move on to the stats and charts. Okay, let's look here at the early down success rate. I'm just going to fly through these because these have not changed. We talked about these last week, and they're very similar. The only difference here, we'll look at the teams that were the biggest movers last week, the Green Bay Packers and the New England Patriots. Although the Packers lost, their early on success rate offensively was very good against the Saints. The New England Patriots obviously crushed and thrashed the Chicago Bears. We'll talk about those games more in detail as we break down the games. Arizona and Tennessee both looked bad. Tennessee lost, Arizona won, but their early on success rate offense was not very good whatsoever. Flipping over to the defenses, again, no surprise here. The top 5 teams and the bottom 5 teams are all the same. So we're still looking at a Miami Dolphins team when, if you look at that prior slide, they moved into the rising section. Their offense is getting a little bit better, and they already have the top 5 early down success rate defense. So that team is becoming pretty scary and pretty interesting, in my opinion, from an efficiency, early down success rate perspective, both offensively and defensively. I'm liking what I'm seeing out of Miami right now. One of the most complete teams based upon this metric that we have in today's NFL. Otherwise, not a whole lot to talk about here. What I didn't show you last week was the 30 and in touchdown percentage. I'll go ahead and show that to you right now. These are not in any particular order. It's just a collection of the top 7 and the bottom 7 teams. You can see right away that the bottom 7 teams, we've got several 7-loss teams in the league right now. Those guys are over here at the bottom 7. They just so happen to be part of this metric's worst teams, and obviously this translates out onto the field in terms of wins and losses as well. Look at the top 7. You'll find all the teams there. Some of the surprising teams that are making their way up the list include the Kansas City Chiefs, who, despite being 4-3, have been very strong against the spread this year and has done very well in this third and in touchdown percentage metric. And just the background, I'm sure you guys know, a lot of you guys know what this statistic is. This is one of the two statistics I talk about here early on, success rate and this metric, that I kind of invented myself. And what I'm looking at here for 30 and in touchdown percentage is percentage of drives that start from average starting field position, which is inside your own 30-yard line, that result in touchdowns being scored. Driving into field goal range is great, and kicking three on the board is obviously helpful for most teams. But in this age of scoring and points, you really have to try to go for sevens. And so scoring field goals and being good at driving the ball to your opponent's 35-yard line and kicking a field goal is not really all that tremendous in my book. It's about scoring touchdowns. And so the other thing that this statistic helps eliminate are teams who just so happen to get fortunate field positioning off of a turnover or something like that. The perfect example, obviously, the Pittsburgh Steelers a couple of weeks ago. They got 2 turnovers inside the Houston Texans' 8-yard line, and they scored touchdowns on both of those. This team is not very good inside the red zone, but when they got such great field position, they were able to punch both those scoring attempts in. The one drive of the entire game that they actually had where they marched the ball from their own territory at average starting field position and actually got into the red zone of the Houston Texans, they did not score touchdowns. So sustaining and maintaining these longer drives for them a couple weeks ago was a problem. Obviously, last week against the Colts, they were able to score in bunches, but this statistic tries to eliminate teams who just have a random good fortune of a turnover, tries to eliminate those statistics from, the long-term and long-range analysis of these teams. So there you have it, 30 and in touchdown percentage. Let's get into the meat of this podcast where we start breaking down the results from last week.